The photograph exists. That much is confirmed. It was taken sometime in October 1969 in a garage in Pasadena that had been converted into a training space. Heavy bag in the corner. Mirror along one wall, cracked at the bottom right where someone had kicked it and apparently never got around to replacing it. Rubber mat on the floor. The smell of liniment and old sweat that every serious training space eventually develops, a smell that functions as a kind of credential. This is where actual work gets done. Two men in the frame. One is well known, the other is not. The well-known one is 5 feet 7, 135 pounds, looking at something just outside the edge of the photograph with the quality of attention that made photographers keep shooting. That sense that whatever he was about to do
just
next
keep away.
would be more interesting than whatever
Go
he
on.
had just done.
It's not
The
your...
other man is larger, wider through the shoulders. His hands are wrapped and he is looking directly into the camera, and the expression on his face is the hardest thing in the photograph to read. It is not hostility. It is not admiration. It is something that sits in the narrow space between them. The expression of a man who has spent a very long time preparing for something and is now standing in the same room as it. That man's name was Ray Doyle. And Ray Doyle had been training for 2 years, specifically to beat Bruce Lee. To understand why, you have to understand what it felt like to be a serious fighter in Southern California in 1967, not a hobbyist, not a student pursuing discipline or self-improvement, a serious fighter, the kind of man who trained 6 days a week and entered full-contact competition, and had the particular combination of ability and ego that made him look at the martial arts world around him and feel a constant, low-level frustration. Because most of the people in that world, from where Doyle stood, were not being honest about what they were actually capable of doing under pressure. Doyle had come up through the karate circuit, San Diego first, then Los Angeles, where the competition was denser and the standards were higher, and the people who trained seriously began to know each other by reputation before they ever met in person.
Kick me.
He had a record. He had the kind of reputation that spread
Kick
through
me.
gyms before it spread anywhere else. A big man who did not fight like a big man, patient and precise and capable of making assumptions expensive. He was not easily impressed. He had worked too hard and seen too much to extend that particular courtesy to people who had not earned it. He heard about Bruce Lee the way most people on the Southern California circuit heard about Bruce Lee in 1967. Third hand, in pieces, the way reputations travel through gyms, the way water moves through rock, slowly and then suddenly. A Chinese guy, works in television, the Cato role, runs a school in Chinatown. Students who come out of there move differently. The speed is unusual. The angles are different from anything in the traditional curriculum. Doyle was professionally skeptical. He had watched charisma get mistaken for ability often enough to treat reputation as a hypothesis rather than a conclusion. He filed the information and kept training and waited for something he could evaluate directly. Then, in the summer of 1967, he saw Lee demonstrate at a tournament in Long Beach. The specific nature of what Doyle witnessed that afternoon, what it was, technically, that produced the effect it produced on a man who was paid, essentially, to not be affected by demonstrations. That is one of the things in this story I genuinely cannot give you with certainty. The people who were there that day describe the event in ways that diverge in their specifics. What is consistent across every account is the outcome. Ray Doyle drove home from Long Beach in silence, pulled into his garage, stood there for a few minutes looking at the heavy bag, and then began doing something he had not done before. He started taking notes. Not training notes, strategy notes. The premise he started with was reasonable, if you understood where it was coming from. He did not believe Bruce Lee was unbeatable. He believed Lee had genuine advantages. Speed that was statistically unusual, reflexes that operated outside the range most fighters trained to account for, a way of controlling and reading distance that made the standard approach and strike sequence These advantages were not the same as invulnerability. Every advantage created a corresponding angle of attack. The work was finding the angle. He hired a sparring partner named Willis, smaller and faster than most of the people Doyle normally trained with, and paid him specifically to be as quick as he could manage and to punish any slowness in how Doyle closed distance. For 6 months, that was most of what Doyle did, not his usual training. Specifically this: he was building a capability with a particular application in mind, and he was willing to sacrifice breadth for depth in a way that most fighters are not, because most fighters do not have a fixed target. He studied film. This was not easy in 1967. You could not simply pull footage from a device in your pocket. But Lee had television appearances, demonstration recordings, enough material to build a working model of how he moved, what angles he favored, where the distances tended to compress. Doyle watched the footage the way an engineer studies a structure he is trying to understand under load, looking for where the stress concentrated, looking for what the structure was not designed to handle. He talked to people who had been on the mat with Lee. Not many were willing to give details. There was a loyalty at work and a pride that made specific information hard to extract. But some were, and the ones who talked gave him fragments that he assembled into a theory, not a certainty. A working hypothesis about specific angles and distances where Lee's particular approach might be vulnerable to a particular kind of pressure. He kept going at 5 in the morning when it would have been easier to stop. By early 1969, Ray Doyle believed he had built something. He wanted to test it. Getting the meeting took 8 more months. The Southern California martial arts world was small enough in 1969 that connections existed between most serious practitioners, but Lee was increasingly difficult to reach directly. His schedule was dense and getting denser. The school, the private clients, the film work that kept almost breaking through and then not quite. The specific exhaustion of being close to something without being able to fully grasp it. He did not move through obligations slowly. Pinning him down required knowing the right person at the right moment. Doyle eventually went through a man named Carter, who operated in the productive intersection between the martial arts world and the Los Angeles film industry, and who had developed over years of working in that intersection a talent for making introductions that benefited everyone involved. Carter knew Lee well enough to make a call. He knew Doyle well enough to frame the request correctly. The meeting was arranged for a Tuesday morning in October 1969. The garage in Pasadena, a neutral space that belonged to neither man. Doyle arrived 20 minutes early. He always arrived early. He stood in the empty garage and looked at the cracked mirror and the heavy bag, and did what he had been doing for 2 years. Went over the theory, the angles, the specific pressure points in Lee's approach that he had identified through film and fragments, and 10,000 repetitions against a sparring partner who was not Bruce Lee, but who had been paid to be as close to Bruce Lee as a different human being could be. He went through it one more time, standing in that garage alone, the way you check a calculation before you submit the answer. The door opened. 5'7", 135 pounds. He carried a bag and moved with the quality that people who saw him in person always mentioned first, not speed, not size, but presence. A sense that the air in the room had reorganized itself around whoever had just entered it. "You're early," Lee said. "I'm always early," Doyle said. Lee looked at him. Not long. A second, maybe 2. "That's a habit," he said, "that tells people more about you than you probably want them to know." I have spent time with that sentence. I cannot fully decide whether it was tactical, a deliberate attempt to put Doyle off balance before anything physical happened, or whether it was simply what Lee thought when he looked at a man who had been standing in a borrowed garage for 20 minutes, working up to a meeting he had spent 2 years arranging. Possibly the distinction does not matter. With Lee, several accounts suggest the tactical and the genuine occupied the same space without contradiction. He meant things strategically and stated strategies sincerely. They wrapped their hands. The photograph was taken during this period. Carter had a camera, used it for 3 shots, then put it away when it became clear that neither man wanted it present for what came next. The first session lasted approximately 20 minutes. I want to be careful about what I claim here. 3 people in that garage produced 3 accounts of what happened. Carter's is the most generous and the least detailed. Doyle's account, reconstructed from conversations his son recorded years later, is the most specific. Lee's is the most oblique. A letter written the following November that refers to the man from Pasadena without ever using a name, which tracks with the timeline but cannot be definitively confirmed as referring to Doyle. What appears in all 3 accounts? They sparred. The first session was hard. Both men were operating at the edge of their ability, which is a different quality of sparring than anything below that threshold. What appears in 2 of the 3, Doyle landed something in the first 10 minutes. The accounts hedge, something that connected, a strike that got through, but they agree that something landed. This matters. It means the theory was not entirely wrong. It means 2 years of early mornings and filmed footage and fragments from reluctant witnesses had produced a real result, however briefly. What appears only in Doyle's own account, that for approximately 90 seconds, the theory worked, that the angles he had identified and drilled produced the pressure he had theorized they would produce, that for 90 seconds, in a garage in Pasadena in October 1969, the 2 years made complete sense. And then Lee adjusted. Everyone who sparred with Bruce Lee in any serious context eventually describes the same experience in different words, and it is consistent enough across enough different people that it is almost certainly real. What they describe is not quite speed, though speed is part of it. It is more like the experience of solving a puzzle and then understanding that the puzzle has been watching you solve it. You find the pattern, you begin to exploit the pattern, and then the pattern is simply gone, replaced by a different one that accounts specifically for the approach you just used. Lee had compressed the gap, the lag between recognition and behavioral adjustment that most fighters experience as a delay that opponents can live inside, to something close to instantaneous. He did not need to be hit repeatedly to understand what was coming. He needed to be hit once, and sometimes, from the accounts, once was more than he required. Doyle had spent 2 years building a theory and drilling it until it was in his body, rather than just his head. Lee spent 90 seconds understanding it and another 90 making it irrelevant. That is a hard sentence to write about someone's 2 years, and I am not certain it is accurate in exactly those proportions. But the shape of it, the recognition and the closure, fast enough that Doyle felt both happening while they were happening, that I believe. What I did not expect to find when I first went through Doyle's notes was what came immediately after. They stopped. Lee produced water. He poured some, handed Doyle the bottle without comment, drank from his own. They stood at opposite ends of the mat, both breathing hard. The garage was warm. The cracked mirror reflected both of them in pieces. "What were you doing in the first 10 minutes?" Lee asked. Not, "What were you trying to do?" What were you doing? Present tense, as if describing an ongoing choice rather than something already finished. Doyle described it. The angles, the distance pressure theory, the approach he had assembled from film and fragments and 6 months of drilling against a man paid to be as fast as he could be. He laid it out directly, without defensiveness, the way you describe work to someone you can tell is listening with real attention rather than waiting for their turn to speak. Lee was quiet. "That would work," he said. Doyle said nothing. "Against me 6 months ago, maybe 12. The silence that followed is the moment that Carter remembered most specifically, telling the story more than 2 decades later. Not because of what was said, because of what Doyle did with it. He laughed, not bitterly, not with the hollow sound of a man performing acceptance he does not feel. He laughed the way you laugh when something is both painful and exactly, specifically true, when the truth of it clarifies something that had been blurry, and the clarity costs you something, but you are glad to have it. "How long?" Doyle said. "To catch up to where you are now?" Lee looked at him with what Carter described as something close to respect. "Depends on whether you keep training like you're preparing to fight me," he said, "or like you're preparing to fight whoever comes next." The second sparring session lasted 40 minutes. By all 3 accounts, it was different from the first. Not easier for Doyle, harder, if anything, but different in its quality. Less like a test and more like a working conversation between 2 people with a shared technical problem. When Doyle stopped executing the plan and started improvising, because the plan had stopped working and improvisation was the only thing left, Lee's approach changed in response. The improvisation, born of necessity, produced something Lee apparently found worth engaging with at full attention. Twice they stopped and Lee explained something, not in the patient, measured way he spoke to his students at the school, but in the register one specialist uses with another when they are thinking through a shared technical problem out loud. Carter stood at the edge of the mat and understood very little of the specific content and understood completely what was happening. He was teaching him, Carter said. Not like a teacher, like a man who respects another man enough to give him the real version of something instead of a simplified one. Doyle left Pasadena that Tuesday with a piece of information he had not carried into it. Not a technique, not a specific counter. Something closer to a reframe, a shift in the way he understood what he had been doing for the past 2 years and what it was actually for. The 2 years had produced real capability, the improvements in timing, in patience, in the mechanics of closing distance against faster opponents. That was in his body, and it was real, and it would express itself in every subsequent fight regardless of opponent. The preparation had worked. It had simply been aimed at a target that kept moving, and the cost of aiming at a moving target is that you are always training for the version that has already been replaced. Lee's question, "Are you training for me or for whoever comes next?" was not rhetorical. It was a real question with a real answer, and Doyle spent most of the drive home arriving at it. He kept training. His competition record improved after 1969, not suddenly but steadily, in a way that his logs suggest he attributed to a shift in how he oriented the work. Less fixed architecture, more capacity for rapid construction. Less preparation for known opponents, and more preparation for the act of preparing quickly, of adapting to the pressure, of operating well in conditions he had not anticipated because he had specifically trained himself to handle the unanticipated. Whether he saw Lee again is not something I can confirm. A 1971 entry in his training notes references the Pasadena conversation in a way that suggests he was still drawing on it 2 years later. But the reference is brief, and I will not build more on it than it can hold. The photograph holds plenty on its own. 2 men in a garage, one looking outside the frame, one looking straight into it with the expression that becomes readable once you know what the morning contained. It is the face of a man who arrived at the thing he spent 2 years aiming at and discovered, in the space of 40 minutes and a single question, that the thing he had aimed at had aimed him somewhere better than he had known to aim himself. There is a version of this story where Doyle is the cautionary figure, the man who wasted 2 years on a target that kept moving. That version exists. It is not entirely wrong, but it is not complete. Because the work was real. It was real in the first 10 minutes, when something landed that was not supposed to be able to land. It was real in the second session, when the improvisation that necessity forced out of him produced something worth engaging with seriously. The fixed target had been wrong. The work the fixed target generated had not been wasted. It had simply been building something whose final purpose was different from the one Doyle had assigned it when he began. Lee said this in the November letter, the one that refers to the man from Pasadena, and it is the part of the story that I keep returning to when I try to understand what the morning in that garage actually was. He built something real, the letter reads, aiming at the wrong thing. That is not failure. That is the most expensive kind of education. The most expensive kind, the kind that costs 2 years of 5 a.m. sessions and a cracked mirror and a sparring partner paid to be someone he could not fully be. The kind that costs the pride of walking into a room with a theory and having the theory survive for 90 seconds before the thing it was built to defeat simply moved to somewhere the theory had not accounted for. Ray Doyle drove home. He stopped once, at a gas station on the 134. He sat in the car. His son asked him about that stop once, years later, why he remembered it, why it came up when he told the story. Doyle said he stopped because he needed a minute. Behind him, 2 years with a fixed point. In front of him, everything after. And somewhere between the pump and the driver's seat, he understood that the question Lee had asked him in that garage had not given him a new answer. It had returned the original question to him in a form he could finally answer correctly. He pumped the gas. He drove home. He was in the garage by 7 that evening. Not training for Bruce Lee. Not training for the next tournament. Not training for any specific, nameable, filmable, studyable target. Training for whatever would come next. For the opponent who had not arrived yet, whose specific qualities could not be anticipated, whose angles could not be drilled in advance. Training for the capacity to be ready for the thing you did not see coming, which is the only preparation that does not have an expiration date. The photograph sits in a box now, in a house in Pasadena that belongs to Doyle's son. The cracked mirror, the heavy bag, 2 men looking in different directions. If you know what happened that morning, the space between them and the photograph holds something. You can almost see the question still moving through the air between them, crossing the distance from one man to the other. What were you doing? Not what were you trying to do? What were you doing? The man who trained for 2 years to beat Bruce Lee did not beat Bruce Lee. He also walked out of that garage knowing something he could not have known without doing all of it. The 2 years, the film, the 5 a.m. mornings, the theory and its 90 seconds of working and the adjustment that ended it. He needed all of it to be standing in the right place when the question arrived. The expensive kind of education. You do not get to choose whether the target moves. You only get to choose what you build while you are aimed at it, and whether what you build is worth more than the specific thing you were aiming for. In Doyle's case, it was.